it definitely takes some adjustment to, notice that it's like two different data flows, but a single tree. And I think that is not, that is not obvious the first time you try it. I think it takes a little adjustment. And you also kind of learn some patterns of how to deal with it and like how to, I think what I've heard from a lot of people who spend some time with it really and kind of, it's like at some point you just get it kind of in your brain, and then it even becomes rewarding to be like, oh, it makes sense. Like I'm gonna thread this thing through here and thread this other thing through here. And I think the analogy that like comes to my mind is learning knitting. Like when you learn like a knitting pattern where, you have to take the needle, you have to like put it through this hole, this other hole, this other hole, and you have a pattern. And I think it kind of feels similar in that like at first you're kind of clumsy, and then it really becomes like a second nature and it just makes sense. And you start noticing this like adoption, for example, with adoption strategies. I think a big one is, again, like people kind of think of like, I have a client app, it's like from server components perspective, like all existing React apps today are like fully client. And so you think, oh, I wish I could like try to swap out this leaf component like at the bottom of the tree with like a server component. But that doesn't work because, well, like how does it know which props to receive if it's a leaf? And so the things being passed to it depend on state potentially. So there's just no way for it to run ahead of time. And so the adoptions, like you can adopt server components incrementally, but the adoption starts the other way around. It starts from the top. So what you do instead is like you have your entire client tree. And so in the server components model, that's actually a valid server components app. If you imagine there's one server component at the top that just returns your root client component. And so it's kind of like a tree where there's one server component, the rest is client. Again, it doesn't mean that it opts out of server rendering. Server rendering is completely unrelated. Server rendering still works, but it's just you have this one component at the root, and then you have this use client directive that says the module graph below, like this is where we cut it off. This is where the server part ends, and everything below is like it can run on the client. But then gradually you may be, like I'm gonna like you kind of think of this like as a way to create some skeleton or some structure for your app, where you say like maybe I have like app component at the top, or like I have like a profile page component, and the rest is client. But then later you say, okay, maybe I'm gonna have a profile page component that composes a profile cover and profile details, and maybe that contains timeline and about, and then the rest is still client. So you kind of build out like a little skeleton where you can do data fetching at each point, and you kind of pass like async things down. And so you kind of gradually like lift you kind of move those pieces where you transition from server to client world like further down the tree, but you also don't have to. So the thing that sometimes people think of like use client is some kind of like an escape hatch or some kind of a bad thing. But it's really about you're supposed to be able to use as much or as little of either side as you want. Like you can build the entire page with server components. You can have like one server component at the root and the entire page is client, or you can kind of like mix and match them and nest server components into client components and the other way around. And so it's really like as long as you follow the rules, you're not gonna it's not gonna allow you. Like one way I've liked, I was on some Twitter space and I've liked this at the start. It's like server components make client server waterfalls a compile error. Like that's kind of what it does. And I think that takes some adjustment because we're used to accidentally introducing this server client waterfalls with use effects and so on. But it's really just a more efficient, and I think it is a clearer model once you let it settle a little bit in your mind.
Yeah, I think there's also probably some different ways of writing your client components to kind of work more naturally with server components. So, for example, you can imagine a tab component that receives the list of tabs as React children, right? So now the tab component, it's interactive. It keeps track of what is the currently active tab. Forget things like, you probably want to actually do like route. Maybe you might want to integrate with a route, but consider just a simple tab component. It's going to keep state about which tab is selected. Well, there's no reason that just because that tab component has some client-side state, it can take children that are server components and that were, right. And so when you structure your components in this way, so you're imagining tab component, right? A server component can render the tabs, but it's also passing it a bunch of components that are server components. Those server components are evaluated on the server, and then the kind of rendered output of them is passed down to the client to render inside this tab component. And when you have your kind of design components structured in this way, it allows you to like have a lot more flexibility and say, oh, I don't have to, I have a tab element that needs data. You don't have to go and rewrite the tab to somehow work on the server. That's fine, because you can lift that tab component and to be a server component without breaking the kind of model. So once you start thinking and really using React children in that way, I think you get a lot of flexibility to have these apps that are almost completely server. You could if you want to have them be almost completely server components while still having kind of sprinkles of interactivity kind of around them without breaking the rules, as Dan said.
I've seen this referred to as a donut pattern, because it's kind of like this client, this, like in this example, the tab bar, or the tab container component. I think when we think of components, we usually think of like rectangles, right? Like we think of this like piece of the screen is a component. And I think with server component, it's not a new thing. So like React has always supported this, but this pattern has become so much more important in the server components world. Is like, think of like, where do you draw the hole inside your components? Like in the top view component, in top container component, you have tabs, and then you have a hole for the content. And so this lets you, or, some frameworks call them slots. In the React, this is called like props.children, but it doesn't have to be called children. It could be, anything that's passed from above. But this is why, like, I'm talking about knitting, right? Like this, like, put the needle through the through the hole. It kind of feels similar in that you think of your design system components as having holes, and that lets you fill them in with more server component content from above, or client components. So it gives you this flexibility, but you do need kind of to think, to think of like, which components are donuts? Where do I want to leave a hole?
So for me, the key understanding here is the fact that client components cannot pass props into server components. So you can have a server component embedded within a client component, but it needs to get its props from a server component. It can't get them from the client component.
Right, because you're in that example, children is props, right? So yeah, you can pass server components that are in the children prop to a client component. Exactly. Yep.
But then how does that affect, there was this statement earlier that you can't import a server component into a file that contains client components. But if you wanted to pass a server component as a child to a client component to props.children, you would have to import it in the... Right.
So imagine you have, let's say like the root, and it's going to render a tab, and then it's going to render, a few different profile pages as the tabs, right? So you have the root component is a server component. The tab is going to use client, because that's a client component. It has state, but the root component is going to, it's going to return tab, and then within that it's going to say profile details, profile photos, timeline, right, as like different components. And it's the root component that is the one that's importing all of tab and timeline and photos, right? That's where the import is happening. And so it's not that the tab component is actually importing those elements, and that's why it works out.
Right, so it's the root import. That makes sense.
Yeah, so the component, to render children, the component doesn't need to know what its children are, I think is the basic thing that you're leveraging.
Yeah, and I think this is a really common pattern. I mean, like I'm thinking back to if for folks who like maybe I'm dating myself by thinking about like Rails examples, but like I think it's pretty common to have routing solutions that have like a layout. Right, like layouts I think are pretty common in like nested routing solutions where a route can have like a slot that the kind of nested content goes into, and so this is kind of taking that notion of like layouts with like the kind of dynamic slots and saying you can kind of use them anywhere in the tree separately from your routing solution. Right? This is kind of like the idea that Dan's like you're describing with the donut pattern, right? Like that really is like the same as a layout, but you can do that anywhere, right? A tab is like that as well.
But so one thing that's kind of missing for me in this, and I've seen a tweet that you tweeted a while back, Dan, about the fact that you kind of want to see server components kind of replacing API use, as it were, in React applications. That it's just the server components themselves that use the external APIs, but from that point on, it's just props all the way down. And I totally get that. But the one thing that's kind of missing for me with this vision is how do I handle mutations? I mean, with the unidirectional data flow, in client-side land, I handle mutations by passing down functions that I can then call back up. But I can't do that with server components. So what's the mutation story?
Oh, you can't do that yet.
Okay.
So this is a part that we well, I guess like by the time this episode comes out, it's actually well, I don't know what the schedule is, but it will likely be available in some form. But we're currently that is what we're working on now. Is this ability, we're calling that server actions. So we want to make it possible to pass a function from a server to the client. It would have to be annotated with a use server directive. So it has to be annotated that this is something you want to expose. Because it would otherwise be like unsafe to expose arbitrarily callable functions from the server. You don't want to do that. But if it's something that you want to expose as it is similar to RPC. So there are some popular solutions for RPC now. We don't think RPC is a good solution for data fetching. So RPC isn't, and the reason is the same as if you do RPC for data fetching, and for those who don't know what RPC is, it's when it's remote procedure call. Is like an old term, but essentially it just means you call a function on the client as if it exists there, but actually behind the scenes is going to talk to some like server NPI endpoint that's like generated automatically, and then it's going to call like the actual function on the server that you write. So like RPC is this concept of like, I'm going to call a function, but actually I wrote it on the server, and there's some layer in between that kind of translates it and makes sure that like the types match and that it actually works.
It's called a marshalling layer. That's the old terminology from the 80s, like or 90s when I used technologies like DOM and Corba and stuff like that. Yeah, this is what goes around comes around.
But this actually,
for sure.
This brings up another. I think this is an important point. I think most people aren't very good at architecture. I think most businesses don't have a good architect. I don't think I've ever seen someone regret developing their API and then fielding it with their front end or their mobile app to be able to know that it works well. But I have seen terrible, terrible, terrible spaghetti mess time and time again, where people try to map the way the backend will send data to the way that it's going to be used in the view. And then when they need to grow or scale the functionality or the accessibility to third-party partners or whatever of their application, they just got a steaming pile of spaghetti poo because they were so focused on the view rather than the API.
Well, I think that's just I think it's a slightly separate topic from mutations, maybe. But if we jump into that, we're not really taking anything away, right? Like I think you can still build an API if that is what you would like to do. You can call that API from your server components, and you get to define what that API is. You can even keep that API private at first without exposing it, to the entire internet right away. So this is something that you can do. The question is, I think, like from this perspective, the question is like, should you have the option of not building an API and just using your data layer, your model layer, whatever layer you have directly? Like, should you have that option? And we think, yes, of course you should. Like, you have that option in server-centric, like you've always had this option in all server-centered frameworks. Like, they don't force you to build an API layer with all concerns of like, specific how to build it. But then if you want to build an API layer, you can certainly build it later, or you can like institute a policy. Like,
can you
we always
build it
APIs.
Later though? Can you really build it later? That's my concern is if so much of the focus is on render, then the shape of the application will take the shape of the render rather than the shape of the logic of how things are oriented. Yeah,
well, to be clear, like certainly you can build a separate standalone API for your backend. So if you're, for example, if you're starting off. Well,
what I'm talking about practically, I get that, yes, you can rebuild a new server from scratch and interact with the database, but then you're going to be copying all this stuff. And then, so this is what I'm just saying. I think this is a peril to focus too much on the renderer and not consider what the API is going to be. Because, yes, of course you can rewrite your application, but you can't just add an API on top once you've built all of, this type of, if you've built your API to the renderer, you can't just add an API on top of it.
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what API you're thinking about. So, for example, if you're a startup and initially you're creating a website, and you build a React Server Components app, you've got some services behind the scenes. One nice thing, as Dan kind of highlighted, is that you're not forced. If you don't want to, you're not forced to kind of expose your initial kind of internal API to the world before you're ready. You could start by just building your app. When you get to the point that now, for example, you've got a mobile app, or you want to start exposing your internal, actually exposing an API for other consumers, not your app, right? By all means, you can create a standalone, API. I think what you're getting at is maybe the kind of you've got. Is there a sort of business logic layer that is developing inside of your next app? And what you're getting at is that you want to like reuse some of that for this other API. And, that's obviously a question of factoring out that logic so that you can make it reusable. But I don't see how it's really, it feel like, if anything, it's kind of giving you more choice and more options and not really taking anything away, but maybe I'm missing something.
Also, to add to that, it seems that a lot of the other frameworks are not only doing this, but doing it substantially more. If we're looking at what Quick does with the server dollar and also Bling in the context of Solid, for example, for them, like Dan said before, it not only is it the main way in which to invoke server-side functionality, it's also the way to actually get, the preferred way to get data from the server. And in the context of Quick, it's even a way to, if I want to log something on the server, I can do it that way. So they really encourage it in a way, especially given also that there's like no separation of files. It's all in the same file. And I think you're kind of forcing this separation. So I totally get what you're saying, AJ, and I'm totally on the same page as you are. I'm just saying that it seems like, we're heading this way whether we like it or not.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't have the ability to render, I feel there's a great caution. Okay, you guys are big brains. You can probably start a project and know what you're supposed to do and have the right separation of concerns, but there's not any guardrails or encouragement. People are going to tend towards PHP, right? And it's going to end up being, I don't know how much React you guys see of what the little people are doing. I'm sure that you work a lot with the big companies, but I don't know if you see what goes on at the small, medium-sized businesses, because they're probably like really far below where your skill level is and where but it becomes PHP eventually. It's like, if you look at some of these React apps that people are creating, and this could go for anything, right? It's not necessarily just React, but there's so few separation of concerns, and that's kind of one of the things with the React movement was, hey, throw separation of concerns out the window. We don't need separation of concerns. But that separation, that lack of separation of concerns kind of starts on the front end, and as it gets closer and closer to the back end, it's more and more difficult to end up selling that product, right? You want to relicense that product, or you want to sell your company, and you have to go through due diligence, and obviously this is a problem anywhere, right? But if you took Rails, for example, you could sell a Rails app. You could grow a company on Rails and you could sell a Rails app. There's a pattern, there's prescribed separation of concerns. And if somebody needs to go in, unless you hate Rails and you're doing it completely wrong on purpose, you're going to fall into the pit of success with Active Record. And yeah, there's gotchas and whatever, but you fall into the pit of success where if somebody needs to take your application and expose it to third parties or retool it for white labeling or whatever, they're going to fall into the pit of success. And that's where that's kind of the distinction I'm trying to draw, is that, yes, if somebody is super expert, no, they don't need any hand holding. They could take something and they can create good out of it no matter what. But by definition, 90% of people aren't expert. So that's why I'm kind of saying where's the help for the average developer to be able to end up with something that can be sold or can be integrated? Do you get what I'm saying now? Does that make sense? Does that clarify?
I can try to answer this. I think like a part of it is just I don't like the distinction between this like big and little, or small.
Well, you might not, but it
brain.
exists in the world.
No. Please let me finish. Because like, for example, like at Facebook, like I've seen some of the worst React code in my life. Like, I think you're really overestimating, it's not because like engineers are like stupid or something like this. It's because like people work on different projects. They don't always have the context. They don't always, like sometimes you have like somebody who works primarily with backend, but they need to write some front end code, or the other way around. Like they don't know, sometimes like project, requirements change or like frameworks change. So it's pretty natural that like some code is messy. And I think what we, on the React side, we don't really like the paternalistic prescriptive approach of, here's a capability that makes sense, but we're not going to give it to you because you're not smart enough to use it. Like, I think we don't like this. I think we, if we think it makes sense for, your user interface tree to resolve asynchronously, we think it makes sense as a concept on the React layer. And then from that, it necessarily follows that you would be able to, either like call your data layer that can be, ORM. So that's not too far from what Rails does. It, it could be something, on a framework level. For example, like you could build a framework on top of React Server components that is maybe more opinionated about the way you structure data, and then it would like force you to expose everything as an API. But because we think that there are many valid use cases where you don't want to build a generic API, and in fact, server components like one of the inspirations is just kind of realizing that like you could make a mess in either direction. Like if you push everything to the front end, you can make a mess there. If you write like a beautiful API, but it doesn't actually correspond to the shape of what the what the renderer needs, and that, like we've seen that a lot, where you can't safely like remove something from API because you have no idea how it's being used, and so on. So we think that we don't want to limit that ability. We actually like want you to be able to make choices there. And then we think that the developers, like, yes, you can make a mess out of it. And by the way, a lot of pretty big products were made with PHP and people were able to figure it out. And then there's a lot of spaghetti code in the React code bases. But one thing that's, I think, a very important from the like if you're worrying about spaghetti code in particular, one thing that's important, like if you compare spaghetti jQuery code and spaghetti React code, there is one big difference there, and the difference is composability. The difference is that in React you can take a piece, like you can take a component, you can throw it away, and you can remove it, and it usually doesn't break anything, and that's because the data flows down. And so you can take a piece, you can replace it, like you can rewrite the component to take the same props, and then it works. And so it lets you kind of iterate and I think maybe Ryan Florence had this tweet about like React lets me fill a bunch of boxes with garbage, but then it connects these boxes in a way that makes them swappable, and when there's a problem, you can actually replace it. And server components preserves this property where, like if you make a mess somewhere, you can replace that part. But I think kind of more guidelines about how do you do like API structure, like all that kind of stuff. This is something that frameworks can enforce. And React Server Components is not a framework. It is kind of a tool for frameworks.
There's a difference between enforcing versus making it easy and clear. And so that's one thing I'm not trying to say that it should force something. I'm saying that as you come into it, you begin to fall into the pit of success. I'm all for escape hatches. I'm all for libraries that say, here's the function that does everything with the defaults and usually does what you need. And then here's the 4 functions you need to call if, that the defaults don't work and you need to get low level. I'm all for that. I love that.
I would just call out, though, that I think it's very easy in, for example, Rails to fall into the mistake of putting too much logic in your controller when it should have been in a model, right? Right, where it's, oh, wait, why am I repeating myself in this other controller? Like, because it turns out that actually that was like really just more reusable business logic that should have been in the model layer. Like, sure. I think the reality is that any solution is going to make it easy, or even to have like a tiny bit of logic in your template. Because if I recall correctly, ERB still let you put still let you put a little bit of logic there, right?
Yeah,
like it actually still technically kind of worked, right? Like, so there were and like even like what what properties of the record are you fetching is actually logic that's sort of baked in the template. Like the point is that
you can always get it wrong. Yeah, I agree. You can always get it wrong.
And I think, and in particular, the model versus controller was like an incredibly easy thing to mistake in the Rails world, and I think in like similar MVC systems. So I think there's only so much we can do there, but I think it's really about giving people the capability. And it would be great to see. We've seen things like somebody from Expo, I forget, I think it was might have been James Ide, who worked on and others who worked on a version of the Facebook Ent system. So Ent is a framework we have internally that makes it easy to do data loading, but with kind of attached authorization. Like, can this user see this object, right? Is something that's often kind of missing, right? And then literally every single piece of data that you fetch off of that. So, for example, you get a user and then you want to see their posts and can I see their posts, right? And it's just kind of walk the graph like it's doing all the correct checks. And so the folks at Expo released like a JavaScript library. Like it would be great to see more things like that are helping to make like kind of really good scalable data libraries for JavaScript. We think that should exist. And we think that server components would be totally complementary to that. Right. But again, how are you going to build those things if you can't easily fetch data in your React component?
And I wanted to add on top of that,
that,
I think a key issue here is that React Server components are so new and untried. And, I have this talk that I'll be giving where I look at the various ways to deal with the cost of hydration, and I present React Server component as one possible solution. And one of the downsides that I list is the fact that, first of all, you have to learn and understand this new technology, and the fact that this new technology is not battle tested yet. A lot of these patterns that we're talking about haven't been figured out yet. Maybe React Server Components is doing something in a way that's not so good or less optimal or could be done better. The React team have shown willingness to turn things upside down when they feel that there's, a justification for doing so. So I just think that, time will tell in this context. But I do have another question here. And Dan, you repeatedly referred to React Server Components as a specification in the context of React, more so than an implementation. And per my understanding, the one and only implementation right now, I know that there are some experimental ones out there, but really the only, working implementation, I guess, is Next.js. So my question then is Next.js effectively the future of React? Do I have to use something like Next.js or specifically Next.js if I want to be able to use React to its full capabilities and potential?
Yeah, I can try to answer this. So I think it is like on the specification versus implementation side, it's a little bit blurry because we actually do provide some of the implementation pieces on the React side, but not all of them. So the parts we provide are the parts that interface directly with React. So we provide the thing that executes your server components, kind of like the renderer, and that renderer produces our protocol that lets us stream a React tree from the server to the client. So that's we basically provide the thing that like runs them and serializes them. And serialization is actually like what triggers execution of server components. So that's why like if you render a tab container and then you have like a profile tab inside, and so as we serialize the response into our protocol, we're like, oh, this is like a tab container. It's a client component. So we need to tell the client how to download it. Like, where is the script tag? Where to get the JavaScript chunk to download the code for it. And then we're like, okay, now we got to pass, now we need to serialize its props so that they can be passed. And so as we serialize its props, we're like, oh, this child is like a piece of JSX. So we're going to assume it's a server component. We're going to run that. And so that's why it's possible to nest server components into client components because of this like serialization process. And so we provide the piece that does the serialization, and we provide a piece that does the deserialization. So the protocol is not like something that anyone needs to conform to or know about. It's really an implementation detail of React, but we provide this thing that can read this protocol and construct a React tree out of it. So we provide the thing that executes server components, and we provide a thing that kind of turns that output into a normal React JSX tree that you can then render. And that's basically how it works. But then the pieces that we don't provide are, you need a bundler integration on a pretty deep level because server components is kind of a futuristic architecture that assumes a next generation bundler. So it doesn't just, rely on what exists today. It's also kind of our vision for what bundlers should be able to do. And to give you like a sense of, the kind of the gravity of this step is like, I think of it as like the things that we want from a bundler are on the same level of, advancement as code splitting was an advancement compared to always, bundling everything as a single file. So like in 2007 maybe, I think maybe Google had like GWT or something like this. Like maybe that was one of the first. I'm not sure, but I think it was one of the first production kind of implementations of code splitting, and it slowly made its way into open source. So like we've seen, I think require.js, there used to be this bundler that did not have code splitting, but I think Browserify maybe had it, and like Webpack I think is the one that brought the concept of code splitting really to mainstream with require.ensure or something like this. And later, it became a specification with this like dynamic import syntax that gives you a promise. And then behind the scenes, the bundler actually generates a chunk whenever it meets the dynamic import. And so server components kind of, in server components, that part is the specification part. So, and it's conceptually, it's very simple. It's just that there's this directive called use client that acts as a split point. So by default, the module graph starts on the server. So, your code doesn't get, into client bundle at all by default. And then the moment the module graph meets a use client import, that's a client entry point. So use client doesn't mean you need to like add it to every single component that executes on the client. That's not what it is. It's really the boundary. It's like where the server kind of it's like the door to the client world. That's what use client is. And so the bundlers need to be able to kind of use this use client entry points as like, oh, this is where a client tree might start. So I better create chunks for these parts so that they can be, that the client can download them and later it's kind of similar to dynamic imports, but it is tricky because it means that the bundler kind of needs to know about your server module graph ideally as well, because it needs to know, oh, here's a use client that I kind of reached as I was traversing the server graph, and I'm going to need to tell, that there's there needs to be a client bundle for it. And so we see this as like a next generation feature for bundlers, where it's not even specific to React, like use client thing. It's not about components again. It's really about bundling. And I think like TurboPack is the only bundler right now that implements this completely natively. So it's like TurboPack was actually designed to treat server and client graphs as like first-class concepts. I know that there are plugins for, I think for Vita, for ESBuild, I think Bun is also built in first-class support. But there are different attempts to like build plugins for existing bundlers. For example, like Next.js doesn't ship TurboPack by default; it uses Webpack by default, and then Webpack, I think it uses. Well, I'm actually not sure if it uses Webpack or some other thing. But in existing bundlers, you can approximate this, and like it kind of works, but it's not the most efficient way to do it. And so this is part of like why it's. If you wanted to make a server components framework today, you kind of need to be a bundler engineer, because you need to solve this problem. You need to design the next generation bundler, or you need to design an integration into existing bundler that was not designed with this in mind. So you kind of have to hack it in. And like Next actually, like fully is implemented this fully. And we also see some people in the community experimenting with like making it work with ESBuild, making it work with Vite, and so on. And so I think with time, like we'd like to see more server components frameworks that can take full advantage of it. But I think we will see more of that when there are ready-to-use off-the-shelf bundlers that just have this as a built-in feature. So it actually, you don't need to reinvent the bundler. Because the other thing, like if you want to make a full server components kind of framework integration, you have to solve routing, bundling, and like rendering. And so we only give you the piece for rendering. We give you a specification for bundling
and deployment.
And then for routing, you kind of have to figure it out. And deployment, yes. So like you also have to think about like how are you going to avoid like version skew and other problems.
To be fair,
so it's just a big project.
Yeah, to be fair, I think that the future of front-end development is the quote-unquote meta frameworks, which I like to joke and say that the meta framework is any framework not created by Meta. But be that as it may, yeah, I'm guessing, Ryan Coniato, the creator of Solid, likes to say that Vite is kind of raising the floor of bundling, of what it means to build a meta framework, because it gives you bundling out like a boxed solution for bundling. So I'm guessing if somebody does create an appropriate plugin or whatever for Vite, that would kind of solve that problem. But you would end up using a meta framework either way, I'm guessing. I doubt that people will just be shipping solutions on top of, Vite and nothing else. Maybe they will, I don't know, but it seems to unlikely to me.
I'm not sure that Vite is like best positioned for this. I think partially because like in this architecture, you really have like the server graph and the client graph. And I don't think Vite has a concept of two different graphs like talking to each other. And also, of course, like from Vite's perspective, that's just like an unproven idea. So they're not rushing in to implement it because like it's not standard, and that's fair. So and the other thing that's really important is routing. So like Vite doesn't really have any concepts of routing. From its perspective, there's just like one output, and you could layer it on with like a framework built on top of Vite, but I don't know if it's sufficient. So I think that is something we will see, and maybe Vite will like evolve to be sufficient.
It's interesting. I've heard people like looking at Astro, as it were, as a sort of the evolution of Vite, of building other meta frameworks on top of Astro. I think that Solid, for example, Solid Start is actually going to be implemented on top of Astro, as it were, in that sense. So it'll be interesting to see where it leads. But I do have one short question, which is kind of related to what we talked about. Per my understanding, currently you can only put use client at the top of the file, and that designates the entire content of the file as a client-side file. Why can't you put use client in the middle of the file so that from that point on to the end of the file, that would be the client stuff? And so you could put like the server stuff at the top of the file and the client stuff at the bottom of the file. Why this need to separate between files?
It's a bit I don't know, Joe, do you want to take this one? Or?
I'm not 100% sure. Like I think a lot of this comes down to I don't see why we couldn't in theory make that work. But
that was one of the earlier proposals, actually.
Actually,
there was a proposal exactly like this in like 2019.
Yeah. I think the original or even earlier, yeah. But I think part of it is also things like code review. You often in a code review, so there's basically making it harder to mess up for developers so that exactly what is a server component, what code is exposed to the outside, to the world, and what is safely server only callable. I think is pretty important. And when you think about it kind of maybe seems silly at first, but think about code review where, okay, somebody's adding a new call to some like kind of sensitive function, and you just see the standard GitHub UI for code review UI for that change. Is that in a server? Is that server or not? Right now, I've got to go expand the whole file and look upward and see was there a use server or use client here. when it's literally at a file level, it's a lot easier to check. Now, again, so you still might have to go check like the very, very first line of the file or whatever, but it's a lot easier when it's at a per file basis, because you really don't want to have, functions that are not meant to be exposed to the world accidentally exposed because of these types of mistakes. So I think there's some kind of just balance here. And also doing it at a file level, I imagine makes it a lot easier. As I can just imagine how I'd be implementing it right at a file level is probably a lot easier for the bundler. So I think a bunch of considerations. There might be more that I'm missing, but those are the ones that kind of immediately come to mind.
I would slightly, I think I would slightly like amend that. I think I think we've kind of actually walked back on some of this thing, because like early on we were thinking of like, it's super important like in code review and so on. But I think that actually shifted because like in the current model, you actually can't tell, like when you look at a component, because like not every component that executes on the client actually has the directive. So like the directive is not something that you put to say like this component is like runs on the client. It's really contextual. So like if this component is imported from a tree that's like already on the client, then it will act as a client component. And if it's like a component that's imported from a tree that's like already kind of like the module graph is already on the server, and then by default it's assumed to be on the server. And I think like the way our thinking has changed there is it's really not so much about like when you look at the file, it shouldn't really matter from like React perspective, like where does it run? It's more like working with types, because when you make a mistake, you get immediate feedback on like what the mistake is. So for example, like if you start with a component, it's just a function, it doesn't have any special features, and you're like, I want to add some state to it. So you don't use client at the top at this moment. You just use state. You just add some state. And then, if you don't get you get immediate feedback from your development server. Like I think in Next.js case, they have like a TypeScript plugin that does it. So it's the same kind of live feedback as you would get from TypeScript. So if you're already like in a client graph, then you don't need to do anything else. You're fine. If this component is in a server graph, then it will say, hey, like this is a client feature, and it doesn't exist on the server. So you need to add use client somewhere, but it doesn't mean in this component necessarily. It could be anywhere in the parent module graph. So for example, if you're like in this text field component, you just add a state to it, and it says like you need to add the use client. Next actually tells you can add it to text field, or you can add it to like checkout form, or you can add it to like checkout page. And maybe you're like, this checkout page is like mostly client-side logic. I'm just gonna slap use client there, and then I don't think about this at all. Or maybe this text field is used like in different places, and then sometimes you would add it. So there are these decisions, and then like with server-only logic, if you kind of like have a database call, well, your bundler is just not gonna let you, import like MongoDB on the client because it's not gonna let you bundle it. But then the way, if you don't want to leak secrets, or you don't want to, you don't want to expose a bunch of like things that, like if there are things you never want to be bundled, we have a mechanism for this that is separate. It's a special package called server only. So if you just have like import server only, it's kind of like a poison pill. It's like that will prevent it from ever getting like into a client bundle and letting you ship that. And so that's what you put into your credentials file, or like any files where you're like, features you haven't released. Like that's one of the cool cases about server components, is you can use it to gate features which you want to not leak the fact that they exist. So as long as you only like gate, you add server only so that you don't mess it up accidentally and like put an import in the wrong place. But that is a poison pill. And so I think like these kind of things together, where you want to add a feature, you just add it. And then if you get the feedback that actually you can't do it in this part of the tree, you're just going to rewire the tree a little bit to, to resolve, just like you do with types. When you like a different type of this thing is passed, you either fix the thing that's passed or you fix the type. It's kind of similar. But then the reason you can do this in the middle of the file has more to do with, like in a single file, you kind of expect like a single execution environment. So like you expect that you can share variables between them, and it gets like really confusing if you have a function call, like you have some variable, and then either you can't use it below, or like you don't know, how that is going to be shared. I think
right.
that is where it gets really confusing, and so we settled on files as the boundary.
By the way, is there a use server?
Yes, but not for what you would think it is, because people would think that use server is so it's not. It's also like not in a released piece, so this is why you don't see it. Because again, like you might think use server means make this a server component, but again, that's not how it works. If you think of like use client, that's not the marker of the component. It's a place in the module graph where you cut off the client tree. It's like a door from the server to the client. And so by this logic, what is use server? It's the door from the client to the server. So use server is the thing that lets you do mutations, like in the future. It's like it lets you import a function
now I
from
get
the
it.
server.
You mentioned it before. Now I
Mm-hmm.
remember. Okay, now the penny is dropping. Yeah, excellent.
Yep. So one thing that I'm wondering about with a lot of this is, does any of this stuff work with React Native? I mean, we're talking about components and things like that. A lot of the rendering happens on the phone, just like it happens on the web. Some people are using React Native Web. So
I think that Blue Sky is using React Native Web.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the new hotness.
Yeah. So we don't. Well, in principle, it is designed to work with any React renderer, and it's actually a little bit like server components are inspired by many technologies, but one of the inspirations is our internal native frameworks. So at Facebook, we have frameworks that we use for native apps that are like, we use React Native for some parts. But actually, like one of the things that is very limiting for React Native is that it doesn't let you drive the view logic from the server right now. And we have an existing solution that does. So we have an existing mobile framework that is similar to server components, but for native, and it's not in JavaScript, like it's in Hack, so PHP. But it's like part of why we know this architecture works, because that's actually what we use for a lot of our native code. And like we would like to extend this to React Native. We're not working on this right now, but kind of in the big model, of course, like we'd like React to let you target all platforms without compromising on like the same. I feel like there's this React ethos of like use each platform for what it's best at instead of the lowest common denominator.
Right.
And so this was always this idea behind React Native is like we don't just build a cross-platform thing where you have like a component that looks the same way on every platform, but is not actually using the platform features. No, we want to give you like a way to use, iOS, like you get all features like iOS text field, like Android is like Android text field. Selection works natively the same way that it works in native apps. And I think server components kind of applies the same idea to the split between client and server, because it's like you don't run the same code everywhere. It's like you run the things that work best on the server, run the things that work best on the client, and we just give you like a way to combine them. And we'd like to bring that to React Native as well.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, as far as things go, right? I mean, sometimes you can render some of the same things across React and React Native, and sometimes you can't. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea that, I put a server rendered thing, component up there, and, if I have a proper renderer on my back end that can turn it into whatever the Android or iPhone app uses, there's no reason why it couldn't. do the same kinds of things.
I'm not sure that it's allowed in the context of licensing. I'm not sure that Apple likes you rendering on the server.
I've seen some things you can get away with, but yeah, that's usually actually in a web view, not in a native view. So
it's tricky, but I think the part that's that is disallowed is like kind of hot swap in native code, right? But I think the boundary between what does it mean to render on the server? Like, you don't add any new native components with behaviors that Apple can't check. It's just orchestration of the components that are already on your device. And you think there's this gap between I'm returning some data, or I'm just returning the UI tree of process data. It's not really such a big leap. It's just you do a bit more work ahead of time.
I'm not trying to make any sense of the Apple rules.
Yeah. Well, and
don't take my word.
Yeah, some of that remains to be seen. Yeah.
You need to invite some people from Apple, and maybe they will tell you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're getting to the point where people actually need to pull off. We kind of went over a bit. And I think somebody just tried to come in because Xfinity is probably here to look at my internet. So let's go ahead and do some picks real quick. Let's have Tejas start us off.
Awesome. Do you mind explaining what picks are for?
In that case,
it's just shout outs about whatever. Yeah.
Unless you don't want to go first.
Dan can go first. Dan, show us how it's done.
Unfortunately, I don't really have that much in terms of picks this time. I will say this. One of the great things about participating in conferences is that you get to, if you can, then you can do a bit of traveling and sightseeing. I'm heading out at the time of this recording to a conference in London. Afterwards, we'll be touring in southern France, and that should be lovely. And then about a couple of weeks afterwards, I'm going to a conference in Portugal, and then, of course, we'll be touring in Portugal. So my pick is, go speak at conferences because you can do a lot of sightseeing afterwards, and these countries are beautiful, and it's highly recommended. Other than that, we watched the TV series on Netflix called Beef. We loved it. It was so wacky and out there, and somehow I could crazily relate to all the characters there, although they were pretty extreme. But still, sometimes you watch shows and you get disinterested because you can't relate to any one of the characters there. Here we just, we were binging it because everybody was in a weird way so relatable. So I highly recommend that TV series, and those would be my picks for today.
Great.
Awesome. Tejas, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for teaching me that, Dan. So about conferences, huge pick. I was just at React Miami, in case you can't tell, and definitely a huge pick. A lot of people have been complaining that a lot of the talks weren't about React, but I think these people kind of missed the point that React is an ecosystem more than just a library. And so there were some fantastic talks about CSS and their applications for our web apps. And I actually kind of liked that it was so community driven and focused. It was a great time. And also the sightseeing in Miami and so on was very nice. So +1 to that. We've also been watching Beef, phenomenal show. I have 2 picks really. Shout outs that I think are worth appreciating. Blue Sky, I got access today, and it's tremendous. The capabilities of this quote unquote alpha. I don't honestly think it's an alpha. This is the best alpha I've ever used in my life. The engineering quality, the way things just work reliably. Some parts are even more stable than twitter.com. So absolutely love Blue Sky. And then the other pick that I had is a beautiful book that has just helped me a lot because I tend to have interest in mental health psychology and as navigating my own mental health, but also things like motivation and addiction and things like that. And there's an awesome book called The Molecule of More that has just been fantastic in understanding kind of health and how we find motivation. Where does it even come from and things like that. So The Molecule of More, fantastic book that I've kind of been exposed to lately and has just been changing
So
a lot of the ways
by the time I return from vacation, will anybody be left on Twitter, or will everybody would have already moved on to Blue Sky?
I don't know. It's getting that critical mass. And their head of developer relations just opened her account, and I'm already like talking about like how can we get an API, because I would love to create some type of open source, like I post to Twitter and then it automatically goes to Blue Sky, and at some point I can just
I'm doing that with Mastodon, by the way. Everything that I tweeted also posted to Mastodon.
Yeah. So anyway, I won't take up too much time. Those are my picks. I guess we pass it around. I'd pass it to Joe.
Yeah. Well, I need to go next because I need to go see if my kid's trying to walk in here.
Go for it.
The Xfinity technician before he runs away. Real quick, I'm going to throw out a couple picks. My board game pick this week is Iberian Gauge. It's another one of the train games, kind of like Irish Gauge, which I picked before. And it's a little different because you buy stock in the company and then you spend the company's money to build the trains. And then you kind of tally it out at the end. So it's not a terribly complicated game, but it does have some unique gameplay elements to it that I really like. So I'm going to get the Board Game Geek rating here, and then I'm also just going to shout out, it's a weight of 2.32, so easy casual game for people. The other thing I'm going to just shout out about is that I am doing the game dev meetups on Thursday mornings at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, so that should be doable for people in Europe as well. We're just working through the course and building games, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So those are my picks. Dan, why don't you go next?
I think Dan, you have to go next because you're getting progressively darker, and pretty soon you'll disappear on us.
Yeah. Sure. I wasn't sure what to put in the beginning, but now I have a better idea. So also shout out to Beef. We started watching, my wife and and I want to give a shout out to another show called White Lotus, because we watched that one before and we were really like, we wanted to have something that has like a similar, I guess, like mood.
Vibe.
And I think it has some like it has this vibe of like, you kind of like, you don't find characters, like you don't necessarily like find them very nice, but you do really like feel for them, and you kind of see each, like they all have a point, like they all have some kind of perspective. And I think that like if both White Lotus and Beef kind of have that in them. So we really appreciate that. Also, another shout out to Blue Sky. One thing I want to specifically call out there is it has this feeling that like they know what they're doing, which I don't get with Twitter anymore. And specifically, like one of the first things that I was like, wow, that's such an obvious decision in retrospect, but your Blue Sky handle is is kind of like a domain. Like you can have if you own a domain, you just verify it and that becomes your handle. And it's just so obvious in retrospect that this is how, we already have a system for verification. It's not like pay, $8 to Elon Musk. It's like pay $8 to GoDaddy. But I mean, it's just nice that it's portable. So, and like a lot of people already have it. And that was like a design decision that I was like, oh, it seems like, they're doing something that actually like has some sense. And then the UI is actually nice. And I mean, they're still like working through a bunch of stuff. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about the people building it. And yeah, shout out to Blue Sky. I want to give shout out to Terence Tao, who's like a famous mathematician. But he wrote a book that I've been working through for the past like maybe year and a half. I'm still in chapter 5, so I'm like in the beginning, but it's called Analysis. And if you ever wanted to kind of learn math from first principles from scratch, without assuming any university education, anything like this, in a way that's rigorous and that kind of just like explains how math works almost from like a programming perspective, where, you know, if it isn't written, then it doesn't work. So this book gets you from like axioms that are necessary to establish even like, you know, 0 is a number, like 1 is a number, and so on. And then you're forced to prove literally everything. So like there are exercises, like you have to prove like A plus B equals B plus A. Until you prove it, you can't use it. And so I've been doing this like for the past year and a half, and I do this kind of for fun. So I think I've done like maybe 100 exercises so far. But it's just a really nice way to understand how mathematics actually works. And I think maybe that's it for my base.
I studied this stuff in logics in the university, and it was pretty hard. It's surprisingly hard to prove the basic stuff.
Yeah, it is.
That's cool.
Sounds like fun, though. All right, Joe, what are your picks?
So I've been playing, so you mentioned board games. So Dragonimo has been a hit. So I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and so it's really hard to find a game that like the 3 of us or the 4 of us, if my wife plays, can actually play together, because the 2-year-old like can't, you know, she just like grabs things and destroys. But like that game is just simple enough that she can like, with a little bit of help, actually like place tiles and like get and she loves like getting dragons and like getting to pick the egg. So it's like perfect for if you have young kids and are looking for a board game. That's a fun one, Dragonimo. And then I've been learning guitar and trying to wrap my head around like the basics of music theory and like scales and stuff. It's just been a very different way of thinking, totally different from programming. So it's a very nice like way to just escape all the stuff that I'm usually thinking about, and just like just kind of, it's almost like meditative, like just like me, guitar, music in front of me, and trying to like actually replicate what I see there. So that's been a really fun experience. That's all I got.
That one's not actually on Board Game Geek. Usually I can find them on there and tell people about how it is, but yeah, it's definitely looks like it's a kid's game. So yeah, there are a lot of terrific kids games. I've picked some of them on the shows too, so if you're interested, you can actually just DM me on Twitter or something.
Oh, cool.
I hand you a whole bunch.
Awesome.
But yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for coming, guys. This was super awesome.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah,
thanks for having us.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll wrap it up here. Till next time, folks. Max out.
Bye.